Good morning. Well, it is here anyway. Lovely sunny, so we're out on the patio. Excuse any rather loud bird noises. And we've got the chickens next door, so I apologise in advance if we've got any animal noises in the background. Today we're going to look at two manual things: manual mode and manual focus. Over the last few videos I've had several people come back to me and ask, especially on the Z5, which obviously applies to all the other Z cameras, and in fact any mirrorless camera, about manual mode. Do I use it very often? Is it difficult? Is it worthwhile? Does it matter? And also, possible to put lenses other than Nikon G lenses onto an FTZ adapter to use on a Nikon camera. I'll answer that question as well. Both fairly quick. Let me deal first of all with the manual mode. So we're just going to put the manual mode, use the dial on top and switch to manual. So we've now got complete control of the three things that affect exposure. Okay, so the modes, remember, we're just thinking about exposure. And as I'm sure you know, we have three things that affect that. We've got the shutter speed, we've got the aperture, and we've got the ISO. Why use it? Well, at a wedding, where I take, say, 1,500 photos in a day, 1,400 of those will probably be on aperture priority. It's what I use pretty well all the time. So I've set the ISO to auto. And again, this isn't just Nikon. I did it on the Sony A7 III when I had that. I know Canon have something similar. It might be called something different, but it does the same thing. So the ISO is set to auto, and you can set the maximum ISO, which on this camera I would is set to 25,600. The low light quality, image quality is able to stand that sort of ISO, and I would set the minimum shutter speed to a 200th of a second. Now you can, on the Nikon, on the Sony, probably on Canon, set the minimum shutter speed to be related to the lens you're using. So for instance, a 35 lens like this, the camera would use probably a minimum shutter speed of a 25th of a second. It might choose a 50th of a second, but something in that sort of ballpark. And you can adjust that. You can probably make it a little bit faster, you can make it a little bit slower. But if you change the lens, the minimum shutter speed will change depending on the focal length of the lens. Now, I don't use that because at a wedding I'm photographing people mainly, and people move. And and most of my shots are with the 35mm lens on the Z5, that means I'm going to be shooting people possibly at whatever it is, 25th or 50th of a second. That's really too slow because people move. It's inconvenient, but they do it. And even if they're only moving their head, at kind of that sort of speed, it's nothing fast. But if you work it out, what a 50th of a second means in terms of movement, they will have moved, even if it's only a millimetre in a 50th of a second, less than a millimetre, quarter of a millimetre. How thick is an eyelash? I don't know, but it's probably less than a quarter of a millimetre. So it means that eyelash is not going to be in focus because it's moving faster than its entire width. So you're not going to get tack sharp images of people, even if they're just doing normal everyday stuff at a 50th of a second. I choose a 200th because the ISO performance of cameras these days is able to push the ISO up and keep the speed fairly high. However, there are times when a 200th of a second, so the aperture priority settings that I use with the auto ISO, are not good enough. If I go outside and maybe it's a bit of a dull, overcast day, or maybe it's indoors and at the wedding they've organised, I don't know, a trampoline or a bouncy castle or something, and the kids are running around, sometimes the guests are running around, and you want to get that action shot. Well, a 200th of a second really isn't going to do it. So I've I could set it up as a different preset because we've got U1, U2 and U3. I could set that up. I use those for focus modes. So what I would do, because I've got at least a few seconds that I know I'm going to take these shots, I would go to manual mode and I would set the aperture. So what depth of field do I want? And remember that depth of field is affected by the distance from the camera to the subject. So if I'm photographing my hand at 1.8, then I'm probably going to have, even on a 35mm lens, I'm probably only going to have a couple of millimeters in focus. If I photograph a plant over there in the distance at 1.8, I'm going to have probably 3 or 4 inches. Should we talk metric? 100mm in focus. So it's affected by where the subject is. Don't forget that. And that's the first thing I said, the aperture. What do I want to do? So that's determined by the whole scene, the composition and so on. Speed. People jumping up and down on the trampoline, I'm going to want probably a 0.002 of a second I would use for that. Depending, if it was a bright sunny day, I would possibly go to 4,000. And if it's a really bright sunny day and they're in the sunshine, I would probably have to go to an 0.008 of a second to get the correct exposure anyway. So the ISO, I would then simply adjust the ISO to get the correct exposure, either by just looking at the viewfinder or by the light meter. And I would then get those shots. And then once we're done, back to aperture priority and back to normal shooting. So don't be afraid of manual. It just means giving a little bit of thought to what you're going to shoot. Aperture first, speed second, ISO to get the correct exposure. It's a very simple formula. And there most definitely are times when it's the easiest solution to get a good shot. Okay, manual focus. And whilst I'm going to talk mainly about the Z series of Nikon cameras, Z5 in my case, with the FTZ adapter on, what I'm going to say probably applies, I know it applies to the Sony A7 III because I used it for 2 years, but it probably also applies to Canon mirrorless cameras and Fuji and pretty well everyone else's. People have this, or I get the impression that many people have the impression that manual focusing is difficult and that you can only use, on this camera with the FTZ adapter, you can only use G lenses. Well, you can only use G lenses to get autofocus. It doesn't mean you can't use other lenses. Let's switch to my 85 1.4 D lens. So it's a D lens, so it doesn't autofocus on the Z cameras. I have to manually focus. Usually, this is sitting on the D780 and I would use it as the other camera that I use at weddings. So this one's got the 35 on, the 780's got the 85 on, and I'll just switch between the two. However, if I'm doing a portrait shoot, and I did this at a recent wedding, which is why I'm kind of doing this, because I've actually done this. The lighting was a bit tricky. I was stuck in this place where we had some fairly bright sunlight sort of coming through the corner of the location, and no matter where I stood, I couldn't completely get rid of it. I wanted to make sure that I had the correct exposure, which meant on the D780 I use live view, which is okay. I do use live view on the 780 occasionally when I want face detect or eye autofocus, but I do find it much easier to shoot using the viewfinder. And of course we've got the electronic viewfinder on the Z5, so much easier to get the correct exposure, to get the right look, because as I say, the lighting was particularly difficult. So I'm then into having to manually focus. So how does it work? Okay. Well, regardless of how you've got the Z camera set up, the moment you put on any lens that is not going to autofocus, on the FTZ adapter, and by the way, I'm talking about the Nikon D lens. You could have, maybe you've got a £10,000 Leica 50mm 0.95 Noctilux lens, which you want to put on here. You can do that. You just get another adapter to adapt that lens to a Nikon F mount and pop it on the front. It'll work. Now, when you put any sort of lens like that on the camera, it will automatically switch to manual focus. I've got this, if I switch this to my U1 setting, which is spot metering, single shot focus, it's just gone straight to manual focus. No need to do anything. Now, when you first put the lens on, do go into the menu. I won't bother showing you, but you just go into the menu and it's in the tools menu. If you go there, it's about halfway down through the menus, non-CPU lens data. Just fill in that once. You only have to do it the first time you put the lens on the camera. Put in the focal length and the maximum aperture. What that does, then it means it will write the XF data to the file when you're using that lens. Just helps in Lightroom or Photoshop, whatever you use. When you come to edit the photo, you know what lens it was taken with, what the aperture was, and so on. You only have to do it once. You just give the lens a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, and if you take that off, put something else on, put it back on again, it will automatically detect what lens it is. So you only have to do it. For most most lenses in this situation, you don't then need to do anything. You just use the manual focus ring. On this particular D lens, I do have to switch that across to manual, the focus ring. On, for instance, my G lens, you've got the switch on the side, AF or M. You don't need to actually change that. You can just go straight into using the focusing ring. So, what is, in my view, the best way to use manual focus efficiently and quickly? On the Nikon and most other cameras, you had focus peaking, and on the Sony it had focus peaking, and I did try a couple of manual focus lenses whilst I had that camera. I didn't find the focus peaking on the Sony to be particularly accurate. What I found was that if you change the aperture, you would expect the range of the focus peaking to get wider as you stop down. It kind of did, but it didn't actually it didn't accurately match the depth of field. And when you went wide open, which should have given you a really sort of tight focus peaking, it didn't. It stayed quite wide. So what you had to do on the Sony, unfortunately it was quite easy, was you could set the Sony up so that the moment you touched the manual focus ring, it would jump into zoom with focus peaking, and it would focus on, it would zoom across to wherever you had the focus point on the rear screen, which meant you could just play around with the focus ring until you can actually see it was correctly in focus. Confirm do I focus peaking, kind of, on the Sony, and just hit the shutter. It was okay. I think the Nikon is better because I find the focus peaking to be more accurate. So if you change the aperture, you do see probably a fairly accurate representation of what's going to be in focus with the focus peaking. So the Nikon, I found, is better, and this is better than the Sony, and this is how I use it. When you put any lens which requires manual focus that won't autofocus, it goes to manual focus, and the box, the actual box that you can see on the back of the screen, which I can't do here, but it's a very small box. I think on the Sony you could actually adjust the size of it, if I remember. I might be wrong on that, it was a year ago now nearly. And that box on Nikon, when you're in focus, will go from yellow to green. So to take a shot, you can touch the screen to move the box to wherever you want it once you've got the composition. And then moving the focus ring, first of all you'll get the focus peaking, which gets you in the right ballpark. The box will then go green and you take the shot. You don't need to zoom in. I've played around with this is 85, I've also got my 135 f2 lens, which at f2, if the subject is a couple of meters away, we're probably looking at a depth of field like that. It's actually so difficult to focus that when I use it on my D780, probably 30% of the shots aren't tack sharp, they're not perfectly in focus. The camera just cannot do it. So manual focusing on that lens is very difficult. But you don't even have to zoom in on that one. I found the green box, if you rely on that, as I say, use the focus peaking to get you in the right ballpark, then just fine tune it, tiny little bits of movement until the box goes green, hit the shutter. And that every single time will be absolutely tack sharp. It's much easier than zooming in. When you zoom in, you completely lose the composition, obviously, of the shot. You've already got the box in the right place to get the composition, admittedly, but it's still you still sort of lose the plot a little bit. And it is actually quite fast once you get used to doing it. Let me see how long it takes me. I've focused out to infinity. I'm going to take a shot of a flower over there. Let me just get the focus box in the right place, which of course you can use the touchscreen or the button. So let me now see how long this takes to get this in focus. I'm not sure how long that was. I bet it wasn't much more than a second. And I can guarantee that was absolutely tack sharp. So providing you've got a second, you can use manual focus very, very easily indeed, and that is at 1.4. Obviously if you stop down a bit to f4, f5.6, focusing is going to be that much easier. If you don't believe me, take your G lens, switch it to manual focus, have a play around. You don't have to have a manual focus lens. Play around with manual focus, and maybe that will just tempt you into possibly looking at getting some manual focus lenses. They are quite interesting. Thanks for watching. Back next week. Cheers.